All right, let's jump into a deep dive on the Biafran movement. A story of self-determination that honestly just keeps going. We've got some historical overviews to set the scene, and even some direct statements from modern Biafran organizations.
Draw from the source, you could say.
Exactly. And today, we're going to look at how this fight for freedom that started, decades ago now, is still going on. And we're also going to explore what a future Biafra could look like. And this isn't just history, just dates and names.
Well, not at all.
The stuff Biafra's dealing with, the choices they make, it all echoes in global politics even today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story that's still unfolding, right? It gives us this incredible insight into how people come together and how this desire for freedom how it can survive even through the toughest times.
To kick things off, let's rewind the clock a bit. Back to 1967, the start of the Nigerian Civil War. I think a lot of people, I didn't know this until I started researching. Biafra's Declaration of Independence, it came out of a really desperate situation.
A lot of people don't realize that. Yeah. You really can't grasp the Biafran movement without understanding that context. Imagine the tension, ethnic tension, so high that they lead to massacres. And the Igbo people, they felt completely marginalized. They had no voice, no place in their own nation. That feeling of being trapped, that's what pushed Biafra to declare independence.
So this wasn't some theoretical political thing. This was a reaction to a very real danger.
Exactly. And the war, which lasted until 1970, it left a scar, a devastating mark on the entire region. We have to remember the scale of the suffering during those years. But here's what I find amazing. Even after they lost the war, the dream of an independent Biafra, it didn't disappear.
It didn't die.
It didn't die, yeah.
That's powerful, man. It says a lot about the strength of this movement. And that brings us to, a strong figure. Someone like Chukwuemeka Odimegwu Ojukwu.
Right, he comes into the picture right at this moment. Ojukwu, he was the military leader during the war. He became a symbol of their resistance, a figurehead for a people fighting for their survival.
It's a dramatic start to this whole story, no doubt. But then there's a shift, right? The Biafran movement, it starts to move away from violence.
Yeah, that's a key turning point. As we get into the 1990s, a new leader comes forward, Chief Ralph Uwazurik. And he founds Masobi, the movement for the actualization of the sovereign state of Biafra.
Whoa, hold on. Did you memorize that?
I did.
That's a mouthful.
But it's a pretty clear statement, isn't it?
It is.
About what they want.
Yeah.
And their approach was different. Uwazurik, he believed in achieving independence, but through peaceful means.
So a total shift from armed conflict to diplomacy.
To diplomacy, to advocacy. It was a bold move, especially after the violence of the Civil War.
And did it work? Did this new approach get them any closer to their goals?
It's tough to say. Even peaceful calls for Biafran independence. Well, they faced pushback, a lot of pushback from the Nigerian government. Uwazurik, his supporters, they faced repression.
So the road to freedom, it wasn't smooth sailing, even without resorting to violence?
No, not at all.
So even with this change, the core tension remained.
It makes you think, How do you make a lasting change when the other side just doesn't want to budge?
Right. And as we get into the 2000s, we see a new generation step up. With Madzi Nnamdi Kanu and the IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra.
And with Kanu, things shift again. He takes a different approach, more confrontational. He uses media, especially Radio Biafra, to really amplify his message. He's calling for a revolution.
So a more modern approach, using media to reach more people, to get them on board.
And it did resonate with a lot of people, especially younger generations. But this vocal approach, it also caused more friction with the Nigerian government. Kanu's arrest in 2015 on sedition charges, it sparked huge protests.
Showing just how high the stakes were.
And how deep those tensions ran.
It's interesting, even with these changes in how they try to achieve their goals, the core conflict just keeps coming back.
Yeah, it's a persistent struggle. And it's hard to say which approach was, quote, most effective. The Biafran movement, they face constant challenges. Every leader has had to adapt to the circumstances. What's important is that through it all, the desire for self-determination, it never went away.
Right. And that brings us to today, the present day, where we have Simon Ekpa leading the Biafran movement, but he's doing it from exile. This idea of a government in exile. What does that even mean practically?
It's fascinating, right? It means that even though they're outside of Biafra, the people still believe in their right to govern themselves. It's a statement, even with all the challenges.
So they're not just sitting around waiting. They're actively trying to build a future Biafra.
Yeah, they have a long-term vision.
That's pretty impressive.
And Ekpa's strategy is interesting. He's pushing for a peaceful referendum. Let the people of Biafra decide their own future.
It's a smart approach.
It's about gaining legitimacy on the world stage and putting pressure on the Nigerian government.
But doing it peacefully.
Exactly.
And is it working?
Well, it's gotten attention, that's for sure. Especially from the Biafran diaspora around the world. Which shows you this isn't just a Nigerian issue.
It's global.
Yeah, it's global.
And Ekpa himself, his background is kind of, well, it's unexpected.
A former Finnish politician and a track athlete.
Wait, a Finnish politician?
Yep.
And a track athlete?
Yep, that's him.
That's an interesting path to leading a movement like this.
It is. It really is. It shows you the Biafran movement. It draws in all sorts of people. It's not just about where you're from. It's about a shared belief in the right to self-determination.
So we've got this government in exile, this leader with a fascinating background, and a strategy focused on a peaceful vote. It all sounds very, I don't know, strategic. But what are they doing on the ground to actually move things forward?
This is where things get really interesting. This government in exile, they're not just a symbol. They have a website, the Biafra Republic Government in Exile. And it lays out in detail what an independent Biafra would look like.
So it's not just about breaking away, it's about building something new.
Exactly.
I like that. So what is it they're striving for? What are the key parts of this vision?
Well, one thing that really stands out is their focus on the economy. And their plan is ambitious. They're talking about major investments in education, aiming for 30–40% of their GDP going to education.
Well, 30 to 40%.
That's right.
Huge.
It's more than double what a lot of developed nations invest.
Wow.
They see this as the key, the
Right.
key to unlocking Biafra's economic potential, kind of like Singapore.
Right, Singapore.
They went from a nation with limited resources to a global powerhouse.
It's a big gamble putting that much into education.
It is. But it suggests they're thinking long-term.
And it's not just about economic growth.
No, they're also focused on ethical governance.
What does that mean? Ethical governance.
They're very specific about it.
Huh.
Zero tolerance for bribery and corruption, total transparency and accountability.
Right.
They want to build a nation that is clean, efficient, a nation that truly serves its people.
So the opposite of what they see happening in Nigeria.
In a lot of ways, yes.
It's an appealing vision, I have to admit.
It is.
A nation built on those principles.
And it's not just ideals. They're also thinking about practical structures. They want to use flat organizational structures.
Flat structures.
For the whole government.
For the government, for institutions.
That's pretty modern.
It is. It's about being agile, responsive, cutting through bureaucracy.
Things that, honestly, a lot of governments struggle with.
They do.
They're fascinating. Like, they're taking ideas from the business world and applying them to nation building.
Right, taking the best ideas and putting them to work.
It sounds like they put a lot of thought into how to create a successful nation, one that's successful and ethical. But is this all just, ideas on a website?
That's the question, isn't it?
Are they putting any of this into practice?
That's a great question, and it's something we're going to dig into in the next part of our deep dive. But before we do, there's one more thing I found in our research. I think you'll find it pretty surprising.
Okay, you've got my attention. What is it? We found this list of people who have publicly supported Biafra's right to self-determination.
A list of who?
Politicians, heads of state, even cultural figures.
Where?
From all over, really. Some from the UK, some from the US. We're not talking about fringe figures either. These are established leaders.
Wow.
And then you have heads of state from Gabon, Haiti, Tanzania, Zambia, the list goes on.
This is getting interesting. Keep going.
And then there are the cultural icons. Musician Nina Simone, she was a big advocate for Biafra. And get this, Muhammad Ali,
Wait, Muhammad Ali?
a boxer, yeah.
Seriously?
He even refused to be drafted during the Vietnam War. He saw the Biafran struggle as a fight against religious persecution.
That's powerful, man. That a global icon like him would feel so strongly about Biafra.
It shows you how far this movement's reaches. It's not just a local issue, it's a global one.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've got this vision for a new nation, a leader with an incredible story, and now we find out that some of the biggest names in history have supported Biafra. What is it about this movement that draws in so many different people?
It's a good question, and it's one we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at the moral and legal arguments for Biafran independence. Using statements from organizations like the Indigenous People of Biafra USA, trust me, this is where it gets really interesting. It's one thing to have a vision for the future, but it's another thing to actually, make it happen.
Yeah.
So let's look at what the Biafra Republic government in exile is actually doing to push their goals forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to think of a government in exile as just symbolic, right?
Right.
But it seems like they're actually taking steps to build a real foundation for a future Biafra.
They are. They're not just talking, they're taking action. Like, for example, they're issuing Biafran ID cards.
Really?
Yeah, to their supporters. It's a way of asserting their identity, creating a sense of belonging.
That's interesting. It's like they're creating the structures of a state, even without having control of a physical territory.
It's like a startup nation.
I like that. A startup nation.
Operating in this space between, aspiration and reality.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
They're building a base, asserting their identity. But how do they plan to overcome the obvious challenge of not having a recognized territory?
It's a huge challenge, no doubt. But remember, they're committed to a peaceful approach. They want to gain recognition through diplomacy and advocacy, and this is where those figures we talked about earlier come in.
Right, the ones who support Biafra's right to self-determination.
Exactly.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It is.
Muhammad Ali, Nina Simone.
Aligning themselves with this movement.
It gives them credibility, on the world stage.
Absolutely. Having those voices, those big names speaking out, it gives weight to their cause.
It elevates it.
It takes it from a regional conflict to a global issue.
But let's be real. Biafra is up against some serious obstacles.
Oh.
They're facing the Nigerian government.
Which is powerful.
And they haven't exactly been open to letting Biafra go.
Right.
And even with international support, it's not like the UN is going to step in and create a new nation for them.
It's a complicated situation geopolitically. The international community, they're often hesitant to intervene, especially when there are concerns about stability, resources, potential for conflict.
So it's a tough balancing act for Biafra.
It is.
They need to assert themselves, keep the movement alive, but also not provoke a violent reaction.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
And that's why their focus on peaceful methods is so important.
It is.
They're trying to build their case based on international law, human rights,
Right.
on that principle of self-determination,
You're appealing to the world, really,
trying to change the narrative.
to build momentum for their cause.
Okay, we've talked about their vision, their strategy, the challenges, but I want to go deeper into their arguments, the moral and legal ones. What are they basing their claim to independence on?
Well, one of the sources we looked at, the Indigenous People of Biafra USA website, they make a really compelling argument.
Okay, tell me more.
They frame the Biafran quest not as secession, but as restoration.
Restoration.
Yeah, they're not trying to break away from an existing state. They're trying to reclaim something that was taken from them.
So they're saying Biafra already existed.
Right. They point to historical evidence that Biafra was a recognized entity before the Nigerian Civil War.
So they're not trying to create something new. They're trying to get back something that was theirs.
Exactly.
That changes things, how you look at it.
It does. And they also argue that the Nigerian government has failed them, that they haven't lived up to their responsibilities to the Biafran people.
In what way?
Human rights abuses, discrimination, lack of security.
So they're saying Nigeria has no right to govern Biafra.
Because they haven't protected the people.
It's not just about self-determination then. It's about a state failing to do its job.
Right. And they even bring in this concept from international law, the responsibility to protect. Yes, R2P.
I've heard of that, but refresh my memory.
It's a pretty new idea in international relations. Basically, it says that when a state can't or won't protect its citizens from things like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, then the international community has to step in.
So it's like, if a government is failing its people, the world has a responsibility to act.
Exactly.
And the Biafran movement is using this to say that the world needs to help them because of the abuses they've suffered under Nigeria.
It's a bold strategy for sure.
It adds a whole new layer to their argument.
It brings up some really tough questions about state sovereignty, international intervention, the role of the global community.
It's making me think about these things in a new way. But even if their arguments are strong, is there any chance the international community will actually intervene?
That's a tough one. R2P is a powerful concept, but it's also controversial. There's no clear agreement on when it should be used.
Like it could be misused, right?
Exactly. Powerful nations could use it to justify their own actions.
So even with a strong moral and legal argument, Biafra's path to independence is still really difficult.
It is. But what's amazing is their determination. They face so many setbacks, so much hardship, but they keep pushing forward.
Their belief in their right to self-determination, it's inspiring.
It is.
But it's also tragic in a way.
It is.
It makes you think about the cost of this struggle
The human cost,
and what the long-term consequences might be.
whether they achieve independence or not.
That's a heavy thought.
It is.
The Biafran movement makes us think about some big questions.
About justice, about identity, about what freedom really means.
It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths
About the past, about colonialism, about the way the world works,
about how we draw lines on maps,
and about how people are treated.
even in the 21st century.
Even today.
It's easy to get lost in the politics, the legal stuff. But we can't forget about the people.
No, we can't.
These are real people with real lives, families, hopes, dreams.
And that's why this deep dive is so important. It's not just about abstract ideas, it's about understanding their stories,
Their struggles.
about empathy, about seeing the world through their eyes.
You've given us a lot to think about. We've gone from the history of the Biafran movement to the current situation, the challenges they face. We've explored their arguments, their vision for the future. So what do you think about their prospects? Do you think they have a real chance?
It's hard to say for sure. The Biafran movement, they're at a crossroads. They've gotten some attention. Their arguments have resonated. And they're working hard to build a foundation for a future state.
But the obstacles are still huge.
They are.
Nigeria is still opposed, and the international community, well, they've been hesitant. So it's uncertain.
It is.
What would be the best case scenario for Biafra?
Well, ideally, they continue to gain support, enough to pressure Nigeria into a real dialogue. Maybe even agree to a peaceful referendum on independence.
So the people of Biafra get to decide.
Exactly.
That would be a good outcome.
It would.
But what about the worst case scenario?
The worst case would be a return to violence.
If their peaceful efforts fail?
If they face more repression, there's a risk that some groups might take up arms again.
That would be devastating.
It would.
So the stakes are really high. There needs to be dialogue, peaceful solutions, and the world needs to help.
I agree. The Biafran situation, it shows us that the fight for self-determination, it's complicated.
It's not simple.
It's about balancing rights, sovereignty, moral obligations,
It's a tough puzzle.
with no easy answers.
I think that's a good place to transition to the final part of our deep dive. We've looked at the history, the challenges, the arguments, and the potential outcomes. Now it's time to bring it all together. And think about what this story means for us, for our listeners, for the world. Wow, we've really gone deep on the Biafran movement today. From the history to the current leadership, their vision, the arguments, the challenges.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Yeah.
It really gets you thinking, you know?
It does. About nationhood, about self-determination, about what the world should do when a group of people wants to govern themselves.
That idea of Biafra as a startup nation, it really stuck with me. It's like they're building a nation from scratch, outside of the normal rules, you know?
It is a unique situation.
What if they actually pull it off? What would a successful Biafra look like? Not just politically, but socially, economically.
That's the question they're trying to answer.
They've got these big goals,
They do.
investing a huge chunk of their GDP in education, eliminating corruption.
It's ambitious.
But can they actually achieve that?
There are examples of nations that have done similar things,
Really?
like Singapore, South Korea.
Right. They transformed
They
themselves
invested heavily in education, embraced technology.
and became economic powerhouses.
Exactly.
So maybe Biafra's vision isn't so far-fetched.
It's possible.
But having a plan is one thing. Putting it into action is another.
That's the challenge.
What are some of the obstacles they might face?
Building a functioning government from the ground up. That's a huge task.
Creating institutions that work, finding the right people.
And doing all of that while under pressure.
From Nigeria, from the international community.
It's a lot to handle.
You said earlier that the Biafran movement makes us confront some uncomfortable truths.
I did.
What did you mean by that?
Well, it challenges the way we think about borders, about sovereignty.
The lines we draw on maps.
Exactly. The Biafran movement raises questions about self-determination.
Even within existing countries.
Right.
Do all groups of people have the right to govern themselves? Even if it means changing borders, challenging existing power structures.
These are tough questions.
What would happen if more groups started doing what Biafra is doing? Would it be a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know the answer to that. But the Biafran movement shows us that the world is changing.
That the old ways of thinking about nationhood, about self-determination, they might not be enough anymore.
It's an exciting time.
And a little scary, too.
It is.
It feels like we're at a turning point.
Like anything is possible.
And movements like Biafra, they're pushing us in that direction.
They're making us rethink the way things are.
So what now? What can our listeners do if they want to learn more?
Stay informed.
Do your research.
There are tons of resources online, websites, articles, documentaries.
Don't just rely on one source.
Look at different perspectives, form your own opinions.
It's important to be critical, to think for yourself.
And if you want to get involved,
there are organizations you can support.
In Nigeria, around the world.
You can donate, volunteer, spread the word.
Every little bit helps.
Share information, have conversations, use social media.
It all makes a difference.
The Biafran movement reminds us that we all have a role to play
in making the world a more just place.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
But this story is far from over. We encourage you to keep learning, keep thinking about Biafra, about self-determination, about the future of our world.
It's a story that will continue to unfold.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.